Everybody wants more money. I want more money. You want more money. But is $15 enough? Or is it too much? Hello, and welcome to the show about fun facts and a little bit of science. And today, we're talking about minimum wage. Is that a fun fact or science? Anyway, should it be $15 an hour? We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons, but the most important thing to consider is something that nobody is talking about. So stick around to the end when we dig into the overlooked information. Before we get started, it is imperative that you understand at least one thing. The increase to $15 an hour is not instant. If the bill passes, then it will gradually increase from now until 2025. Plus, federal minimum wage law only applies to employees of enterprises with an annual gross volume of sales of at least $500,000, or certain small firms. But of course, as with any of these wages, a state's law can alter this. As with anything these days, we tend to argue about whether or not the minimum wage should be $15 an hour. But for the most part, the arguments tend to be pretty solid for both viewpoints. The one that doesn't make any sense in any way is when someone gets upset that someone flipping burgers is getting as much as me. Well, come on, can't you see the issue is beyond the minimum wage? You are already underpaid. Be mad at the company, your boss, inflation, rich people, anything but the person trying to survive. This is one of the reasons you should openly discuss your pay rate with coworkers. If you ever hear from your employer that you shouldn't discuss your pay, well, that's technically illegal on their part. To understand the implications of minimum wage, we should take a quick look at the history of it. One reason for Congress establishing a minimum wage was to stop employers from exploiting desperate workers. With no required minimum, employers could force people to work for scraps because they had no other choice. This behavior was happening in the middle of the Great Depression. So, in 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It introduced the first time the federal government set a minimum wage and established the principle that people are entitled to earn a certain amount of pay for their work. Since 1938, minimum wage has been raised 22 times by 12 different presidents. The initial bill called for a 40-cent hourly rate in 1938, but was knocked down to 25 cents to gain votes from leaders of southern states. Jump ahead to 1950, Congress raises the wage to 75 cents. 1968, the wage was raised again to $1.60. This is the equivalent to $11.53 in 2019. Did you hear that? 1968, y'all. 53 years ago. It would be like making $11.53 in 2019. I mean, I feel like we can just stop this debate right now, right? But this was actually the last time that minimum wage would keep up with inflation. 2009, we hit $7.25. That was 12 years ago. And if you've been paying for anything since then, you know that life was a little bit cheaper back then. For example, cell phone bills, they're super expensive now. I don't even know how much they were back then, but cheaper than they are now. All of those wages were federal, so they kind of blanket the whole country. And since each state varies for cost of living, let's talk about the minimum wage per state. Well, some of them. We're not going to talk about all of them. This video is already probably long enough. Several states have actually pushed beyond the federal wage. In 2016, New York and California raised their wages to $15 an hour, which, if you live in those states, then you already know that that's still not enough, at least in the city anyway, but that's still better than $7.25. In 2019, 29 states and Washington, D.C. had wages higher than federal. In fact, as of 2019, there are 8 states that increased the wage based on the cost of living. That sounds pretty good. Alaska, Florida, Minnesota, Montana, New Jersey, Ohio, South Dakota, and Vermont. With all of these people freaking out over $15, I don't think they are aware of how many states are planning to increase their wages regardless of the federal plan. So here are some examples of states raising wages to $15. Florida by 2026, New Jersey by 2024, Illinois by 2025, Maryland by 2024, Connecticut by 2023, and the list goes on, and several are already above $12. If the plan is to push a bill that raises the minimum wage to $15, again, not instant, but annually until 2025, then what are we actually worried about? Now, let's look at some pros and cons for raising the minimum wage and see if we can change our minds or at least come up with some sort of conclusion here. So here are just a few pros and cons as found on procon.org. Well, that's a convenient name. Pro, raising the minimum wage would increase economic activity and spur job growth. Economic Policy Institute stated that an increase from $7.25 to $10.10 would inject $22 billion into the economy and create about 85,000 new jobs over a 3-year period. A 1994 study compared employment in the fast food industry after New Jersey raised its minimum wage by 80 cents, while Pennsylvania did not. Job growth was similar in both states and found no indication that the rise in the minimum wage reduced employment. Con, increasing the minimum wage would force businesses to lay off employees and raise unemployment levels. So that's the opposite of what I just said. Congressional Budget Office projected that this raise to $10.10 would result in a loss of 500,000 jobs, but this is based on a survey of just 1,200 businesses where 38% said they would lay off employees if the wage went up and 54% said they would decrease hiring levels. Pro, the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. Because the federal minimum wage is not indexed for inflation, its purchasing power, the number of goods that can be bought with a unit of currency, has dropped considerably since the peak in 1968. The minimum wage in 1968 was $1.60, which is equivalent to $11.16 in 2016, which is 53.9% higher than today's federal minimum wage. Con, raising the minimum wage would increase the price of consumer goods. A 2013 article by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago stated that if the minimum wages increased, fast food restaurants would pass on almost 100% of their increased labor cost to consumers. A 2015 Purdue University study found that raising the wage of fast food restaurant employees to $15 per hour would result in a price increase of 4.3%, or a reduction in product size around 12%. A hamburger would be much smaller, the researchers said. I mean, that kind of helps solve our portion control too, though. So that's a con or a pro. It's getting tougher now. But even if the price of products tends to increase, you're still making more regardless, right? Is it just consumable products that would have this change? And what about rent? If rent stays the same, then it's still more affordable living for people, right? Right? Pro, raising the minimum wage would help reduce the federal deficit. Since firms are allowed to pay poverty-level wages to 3.6 million people, 5% of the workforce, these workers must rely on federal income support programs. This means that taxpayers have been subsidizing businesses whose profits have risen to record levels over the past 30 years. Con, raising the minimum wage would encourage companies to outsource jobs to countries where costs would be lower. According to the Statistic Brain Research Institute, 2.3 million U.S. jobs were outsourced in 2015, with 44% of companies saying they did so to reduce or control costs. Now, after all of that, have we made up our minds? Should the federal minimum wage be raised to $15 an hour or left alone? So here's a breakdown that you're often going to see when talking about this. 29 states are already higher. Dozens of large employees like Walmart, McDonald's, and Amazon pay well over $7.25, and only 1.9% of workers earned a minimum wage in 2019, most of whom were 25 years or younger. In 1980, 13% of hourly workers earned the federal minimum wage. The number of federal minimum wage workers has decreased from 7.7 million in 1980 to just 1.6 million in 2019. So it sounds like it doesn't matter as much, right? Just a low percentage of people fall into this category, and they're usually under 25, not the head of the household. Well, let's talk about that very important detail that seems to always be missing from any report or article about minimum wage. Knowing that the livable wage is around $15, how many people are actually being paid more than minimum wage, but less than the livable wage? Meaning, who makes more than $7.25 but less than $15? Everything you read seems to only look at people making $7.25 an hour or less. It doesn't talk about someone making $9 or $10 an hour. Look at Texas. 2.7% of their workers make $7.50 or less. Higher than the 1.9% national average, but still fairly low. But 11% of their workers make less than $10 an hour. So we actually have millions of Americans living below the livable wage. Nearly half the population, actually, 44% of the US are employed in low-wage jobs that pay a median annual rate of $18,000. Folks, that's $8.65. And these are adults between 25 and 50 years of age, so it's safe to say a lot of these people are working to survive. So hear this. If we raise the minimum wage to $11.80 an hour, it would help 12.8% of workers. Hey, that's better than 1.9%. If we raised it to $15 an hour, it would help nearly 40 million workers. That's nearly 50% of all hourly paid workers. So, do we raise the minimum wage? I don't know. Look, poverty is a huge issue, and we have to find a way out of this. One solution? Reduce the amount of fees that make the poor more poor. Fines, overdraft fees, late fees are only hurting the poor. If the rich have to deal with these, and most likely they don't, then it's no big deal to pay and move on. If you're poorer than these overdraft fees of, say, $75, I'm looking at you, Chase Bank. These fees are massively impactful. Poverty will not be fixed by simply raising the minimum wage, but it can certainly help. As always, thanks for watching, and what did you learn today?